The mountain air had a way of making the world feel quieter, slower, more honest. The cabin sat deep among the pines, surrounded by a stretch of gravel road that twisted like a secret through the forest. It wasn't much, a two-bedroom structure of cedar logs and stone, but it was enough. After 10 years of city noise, endless meetings, and the hum of streetlights through thin apartment windows, it was exactly what Ethan had wanted. Isolation. That was before the letter appeared on the gate. It wasn't an envelope, more like an official notice, laminated and tacked with bright orange tape that screamed compliance. The logo at the top read, Pine Ridge Property Owners Association. Ethan frowned. Pine Ridge? That was miles down the mountain. The Ridge community was a neatly trimmed world of manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and weekly neighborhood meetings about things like mailbox colors and fence height. His cabin wasn't part of that. It had never been. He peeled the letter from the gate and read. It began politely enough, Dear homeowner, but quickly descended into the self-righteous language of authority. Your property is in violation of several HOA regulations, including unauthorized exterior modifications, visible storage of recreational vehicles, and lack of approved landscaping. It ended with a warning. Failure to comply within 30 days will result in HOA enforcement measures, including property review and potential fines. Ethan laughed aloud, a harsh bark that startled the crows in the trees. Enforcement measures? Against a cabin miles outside their jurisdiction? He thought it was a mistake at first. Maybe they confused property boundaries, or someone new in the HOA office didn't understand that the cabin wasn't within their reach. But when he called the number listed at the bottom, the voice that answered didn't sound confused. It sounded offended. The woman on the line identified herself as Karen Delaney, the HOA president. Her tone was clipped, every word edged with the kind of authority that comes from self-appointment. She explained, or rather declared, that the Pine Ridge aesthetic standards extended to the entire mountain community. Ethan tried to tell her there was no entire mountain community, just a bunch of scattered properties, many older than the HOA itself. She didn't listen. She said things like community cohesion and property value consistency and eyesore prevention. He hung up mid-sentence. 2 days later, a white SUV marked HOA Security rolled up his gravel drive. They didn't knock. They parked at the bottom of the slope and stood there, hands on their belts like rent-a-cops guarding a mall. 2 of them, both wearing polo shirts with the same logo as the letter. Ethan watched them from the porch, coffee mug in hand. They looked out of place against the backdrop of pine, needles and dirt, like plastic, figurines dropped in the wrong diorama. One of them started taking photos of his cabin. That was the moment he realized it wasn't a mistake. Karen, whoever she was serious. He could have ignored them. He could have gone inside, shut the door, let them finish their little performance and drive away. But something about their smug posture, the way they acted like they owned his land, lit a fuse inside him. He shouted down the drive, his voice echoing through the trees. No words needed, just volume. The 2 security officers froze, then quickly got back in the SUV and reversed down the hill. He thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, he received another letter. This one wasn't laminated. It was thick, official-looking, with words like Notice of Enforcement and Compliance Deadline. Karen's signature was at the bottom again, this time with a note scrawled in pen. We will be conducting an inspection next week. Please ensure access is available. He didn't even bother responding. He called his cousin, Mark. Mark had served 2 tours overseas. When he came home, he didn't talk much about what he'd seen, but Ethan knew the discipline and loyalty never left him. These days, he ran a small motorcycle repair shop with his buddies. All veterans, all tough as nails, and all with the kind of protective instinct that came alive at the mention of someone messing with family. Ethan didn't have to say much. Just explained the situation, the letters, the security, the upcoming inspection. Mark had laughed, that deep, amused laugh that usually came right before trouble. Don't worry, he said finally. "We'll make sure you're inspected properly." The next few days were quiet again. The forest went back to its rhythm. The wind through the needles, the creak of the deck boards at night. But the peace had changed. It wasn't the comfortable silence he'd first fallen in love with. It was waiting silence, the kind that hummed under the skin. By Friday, he could hear them before he saw them, the deep rumble of engines rolling up the mountain road. Harleys, a whole group of them. Mark led the way, sunglasses glinting, a lazy grin on his face. Behind him, half a dozen more, all built like stone, all wearing the same patched jackets that spoke louder than any HOA badge ever could. They parked in a semicircle near the cabin, the smell of exhaust mixing with pine. Ethan greeted them, shaking hands, feeling the kind of relief that came from knowing you weren't alone anymore. Saturday morning, right on time, the white SUV returned. This time, there were 3 of them. The same logo, the same smugness. They stopped at the bottom of the drive again, clearly surprised to see the motorcycles lined up like a defensive wall. One of them started to get out of the car, clipboard in hand, but froze when Mark stood up from the porch railing. Ethan watched from the deck as the tension thickened in the air. The security team muttered something into a radio. Mark just folded his arms. The rest of his crew didn't move at all, just stared, their expressions unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. Then came the moment. The SUV doors slammed shut, and the vehicle reversed down the road so fast that gravel sprayed in all directions. The sound of retreat echoed between the trees until it disappeared entirely. The mountain was quiet again. Only the faint ticking of cooling motorcycle engines filled the air. Ethan felt something between amusement and disbelief. He hadn't needed to lift a finger. The message had been delivered. Wordlessly, unmistakably. But Mark didn't look as relaxed. He glanced toward the distant ridge, the one where Pine Ridge's perfect houses sat like teeth on the hillside. "This isn't over," he said quietly, almost to himself. And as the sun dipped behind the pines, painting the cabin gold, Ethan had the sinking feeling that his cousin was right. The HOA wasn't done. And Karen, whoever she really was, wasn't the kind of person to back down after being embarrassed. After the white SUV fled down the mountain road, peace returned to the cabin. But it was the uneasy kind of peace that lingered before a storm. Ethan could feel it in the air, in the stillness that followed the roar of the motorcycles. His cousin Mark and the other veterans stayed for the night, filling the quiet with laughter and stories. But even beneath that comfort, there was tension, the kind that comes when someone powerful and petty has been publicly humiliated. And Karen Delaney was exactly that kind of person. By Monday morning, the first sign of her retaliation arrived. It wasn't a letter this time. It was a certified packet, stamped with Pine Ridge HOA's insignia, thick enough to hold a legal document. Inside were pages of community enforcement actions, violation photographs, and assessment penalties. Every page was filled with language that reeked of bureaucracy and spite. The HOA had decided, unilaterally, that Ethan's cabin fell under their jurisdiction, citing expanded community covenants that had supposedly been voted on earlier that year. It didn't matter that Ethan had never signed anything, never attended their meetings, never even received notice. According to Karen, that no longer mattered. He wasn't part of the HOA, but the HOA had decided he was. The fines listed totaled over $8,000, mostly for failure to maintain aesthetic, cohesion, and unauthorized modifications to a residential structure. The laughable part was that most of those modifications were original to the cabin, built decades before Pine Ridge even existed. But it didn't stop there. A notice in bold letters warned that if payment was not received within 30 days, the association would take steps to secure compliance, including potential liens and property access for inspection. It was clear what Karen wanted. She wasn't after fines or compliance. She wanted control, the kind that came from reminding everyone on the mountain that she was the one who made the rules, and that no one could challenge her authority without consequences. Down in Pine Ridge, word of the incident spread quickly. To Karen's followers, Ethan was now the problem homeowner, the outsider who didn't respect the community's order. To others, he was the latest target of Karen's overreach, another victim in a growing list of people who had been fined, shamed, or harassed until they moved away. Behind the closed doors of the HOA clubhouse, Karen held what she called a special session. She sat at the head of a long oak table, flanked by her inner circle, the kind of people who loved power in miniature doses. They nodded as she presented the evidence against the cabin owner. Photos printed from cheap inkjets, zoomed in on details like a missing fence post, a shed door slightly ajar, an unapproved unregistered vehicle, which was actually Ethan's ATV. Karen spoke with rehearsed outrage about how the mountain was losing its charm, how outsiders were bringing chaos to their well-kept neighborhood. She painted Ethan as a threat, a lawless rebel who had disrespected her security officers and endangered them with aggressive individuals. No one questioned her story. They rarely did. When she suggested a formal inspection, complete with a new team of security and legal observers, they voted unanimously in favor. Karen smiled that tight, satisfied smile, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. For her, this wasn't just about a cabin. It was about ego, and she was about to turn the full machinery of the HOA against one man. Up at the cabin, Ethan spent the next few days documenting everything. He took photos of the property lines, pulled up public maps, printed tax records showing that his land was completely outside Pine Ridge jurisdiction. He even found the old deed, yellowed and creased, clearly marking his property as unincorporated. It should have been enough, but something told him that reason wouldn't matter anymore. People like Karen didn't lose gracefully. They escalated. Mark called every couple of days to check in. He told Ethan that he and the crew had heard rumors circulating at the local bar. Rumors that Karen was planning a demonstration of authority, some kind of spectacle meant to reassert her dominance. The veterans laughed about it, but there was a sense of readiness in Mark's voice. Then, one afternoon, Ethan noticed something strange at the bottom of the drive. A new sign had been installed overnight. It was polished, reflective, with the Pine Ridge HOA logo and the words Community Property, Private Maintenance Road. They had literally claimed his road. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was no longer petty harassment. This was trespassing. Within 2 days, more signs appeared, small ones nailed to trees, each declaring Pine Ridge HOA Property Management Area. Someone had even left pamphlets at his gate about joining the community. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so invasive. Down in Pine Ridge, Karen was getting bolder. She called a mountain summit, inviting nearby property owners to discuss integration of non-compliant areas. It was an attempt to expand the HOA's reach officially, using fear, confusion, and social pressure to get others to agree. The meeting was staged perfectly for drama. Karen arrived early, setting up her display boards with photos of unsightly properties and unregulated structures. Ethan's cabin was front and center. She called it the problem on Ridge Lane. As she spoke, she filled the room with her polished charm, polite, confident, and laced with venom. She described Ethan's guests, Mark and his biker friends, as intimidating, possibly criminal, and dangerous to the peace of the community. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably. Not everyone believed her, but few dared to contradict her publicly. By the end of the night, she announced that Pine Ridge would be filing a petition of annexation, seeking to legally absorb the surrounding properties into the HOA's governance zone. It was pure fantasy. The county would never approve it, but it was enough to scare a few nearby homeowners into cooperation. Karen left that meeting with a sense of victory. In her mind, she was already the ruler of the entire mountain. But what she didn't know was that her little campaign had drawn attention far beyond Pine Ridge. Mark had friends, not just bikers, not just veterans, but people who understood how to navigate bureaucracy. One of them, a paralegal who worked with property law, was already drafting a cease and desist letter. Another had connections at the county assessor's office. They began collecting evidence, photos of the signs, copies of the letters, records of the unauthorized security visits. It wasn't just petty harassment anymore. It was grounds for legal action. Still, Ethan didn't want to go to war. He just wanted to be left alone. But Karen had already declared one. By the end of the week, she sent one last notice, this time an official inspection appointment, with a specific date and time. The notice warned that refusal to allow entry would result in escalation of enforcement. Ethan taped it to the fridge, next to the others, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The mountain was quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that came before something broke. Down the road, he could almost imagine the white SUV headlights cutting through the dusk again. But when they came next time, they wouldn't find him alone. Because Mark had already texted him 3 words earlier that afternoon. "We're riding up." And this time, they were bringing everyone. The morning of the inspection arrived like the slow tightening of a spring. The mountain was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was a tense quiet, the kind that carried the weight of expectation. Even the birds seemed to sense that something was about to happen. The sky hung heavy with low clouds, and the air smelled faintly of rain and pine sap. Ethan had woken early, long before dawn, his mind too restless for sleep. The notice from Karen Delaney, the HOA president, was still pinned to his refrigerator, crisp, white paper stamped with the HOA's insignia and the words, "Mandatory Property Inspection." This letter had declared that Pine Ridge HOA representatives would arrive at precisely 10 a.m. to conduct a compliance review. It was a threat dressed as formality, a performance of authority that didn't actually exist on his land. But this time, they wouldn't be greeted by silence. By 8 o'clock, the rumble of engines began echoing through the forest. It came in waves, deep and steady, until it rolled across the valley like distant thunder. The sound belonged to Mark and his friends, Ethan's cousins, veterans who had spent years serving overseas, now bound by the unspoken code of loyalty that military life had carved into them. One by one, the motorcycles appeared through the morning mist. Black, chrome, and steel, their frames gleamed against the dull light of the mountain. The men who rode them were quiet but purposeful, their presence alone a warning. They parked in formation along the drive, engines cooling with a low, ticking hum. Ethan watched them from the porch. There was a strange calm in seeing them there, a calm that came not from fearlessness, but from certainty. He knew that whatever Karen planned to send his way, it would crumble against the quiet strength gathered in front of his cabin. Down the mountain, in the neat cul-de-sacs of Pine Ridge, Karen Delaney was already preparing for her inspection. She had dressed carefully that morning, her outfit blending professionalism and authority, her HOA badge pinned proudly to her lapel. She had called in her security team, the same men who had fled weeks earlier, though their expressions were less confident this time. Karen had also arranged for a county liaison, a young assistant from the assessor's office who had no idea what he was walking into. She wanted legitimacy, or at least the appearance of it, for her crusade. By the time the convoy of white SUVs began its climb up the mountain road, the rain had started, a light drizzle that made the gravel glisten like glass. The vehicles wound their way through the curves, tires slipping occasionally on the wet incline. Inside the lead car, Karen rehearsed her speech in her head, the one she planned to deliver when she notified Ethan of his violations and documented his non-compliance. But what she found when she arrived at the gate was not what she expected. At the bottom of the long, sloped drive, her SUVs slowed to a halt. Through the rain-blurred windshield, she could see the cabin perched above, a solid shape against the dark trees, and in front of it, a line of motorcycles, a dozen of them, all gleaming and still, like sentinels. The men standing beside them didn't move. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply were. A presence that carried quiet authority, the kind that came from experience rather than titles. Karen stepped out of her SUV, umbrella snapping open with a defiant click. Her security team hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The county liaison lingered near the car door, clearly reconsidering his life choices. The gravel crunched under Karen's shoes as she started up the drive, clipboard in hand. She didn't make it far. Mark was the first to step forward. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The look alone stopped her cold. Behind him, the rest of the veterans stood like a wall, their leather jackets marked with patches that told quiet stories of where they had been and what they had done. Karen froze. Her security team, who had once marched so confidently onto Ethan's property, began to back away toward the SUVs. The liaison muttered something to one of them, but his voice was drowned out by the steady patter of rain on the road. Ethan stayed on the porch, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a mix of disbelief and grim satisfaction. He didn't need to intervene. The mountain itself seemed to have chosen sides. Karen tried to regain composure, barking orders that no one obeyed. Her security detail, now visibly nervous, fumbled with their radios, their voices low and uncertain. One of them gestured toward the motorcycles, as if asking whether they should proceed. The answer came when Mark's crew started their engines. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a statement. A deep, resonant growl that filled the air and rolled through the trees like a living thing. The ground seemed to hum beneath the vibration. Karen flinched. The security officers turned pale. The liaison stumbled back into his SUV, slamming the door behind him. For a long moment, no one moved. The rain fell harder, blurring the world into streaks of gray and silver. Then, one by one, the HOA vehicles began to reverse down the drive, their tires kicking up mud as they retreated the way they'd come. Karen stood there for a few seconds longer, face flushed with fury before following them, her umbrella snapping shut as she climbed into her car. The sound of the engines faded down the mountain road until there was only the rain again. The veterans let their engines idle a little longer before cutting them off. The sudden silence felt enormous, almost sacred. Ethan exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Up on the porch, he knew this wasn't the end. People like Karen didn't give up after a single humiliation. They doubled down. But something had changed in the balance. The HOA had come with intimidation and authority, and they had left with neither. Mark lingered after the others left, helping Ethan document everything: the retreat, the vehicles, the attempted trespass. They gathered video footage from security cameras and wrote down times, license plates, and names. Evidence. Not for vengeance, but for defense. Later that evening, the storm broke fully, lightning flashing through the pines. The cabin shook under the thunder, but it felt alive, defiant. Ethan sat by the window, watching the rain stream down the glass. He thought about Karen, how far she would go, how much power she thought she had. He imagined her fuming down in Pine Ridge, plotting her next move, trying to rebuild her ego from the ashes of public embarrassment. And deep down, he knew that she wouldn't let it go. Not now. Karen Delaney didn't know how to lose quietly. In the days that followed, word spread fast through the mountain communities. Stories twisted and grew as they passed from neighbor to neighbor. Some said a biker gang had taken over the ridge. Others claimed the HOA had tried to seize private land and been chased off. The truth lay somewhere in between. But every version ended with the same conclusion. The HOA had lost. Karen hated that. Behind the scenes, she was already plotting her next play, something bigger, something that would make Ethan regret ever crossing her. And far from the mountain, in a sterile HOA office filled with binders and rules, she began making phone calls. Not to her security team this time, but to lawyers, contractors, and anyone who could help her find another way to strike back. Ethan didn't know it yet, but her revenge would reach far beyond fake fines and trespassing notices. Because when Karen couldn't win through intimidation, she turned to manipulation, and she was just getting started. The mountain was quiet again after the so-called inspection, but it wasn't the kind of silence that meant peace. It was the quiet that settles when someone is plotting, When you know, even in the stillness, that trouble is winding itself tighter just beyond the trees. Ethan had won the battle on his driveway. But in the weeks that followed, he began to understand that Karen Delaney was not the kind of person who accepted defeat in public. She was the kind who bided her time and fought from behind a desk. Down in Pine Ridge, Karen's fury had become a quiet obsession. Her humiliation, fleeing from a cabin guarded by motorcycles and veterans, had spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. The gossip was relentless, each retelling slightly more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed she'd been chased off the property. Others swore her security team had called the sheriff in fear. Every version made her look ridiculous. Karen hated being ridiculous. For days, she worked behind closed doors in her immaculate HOA office, her manicured nails tapping against her desk as she pieced together a new plan. She began reading through county zoning codes, hunting for obscure loopholes she could weaponize. The HOA didn't have legal authority over Ethan's property, but maybe the county did. If she couldn't control him through her association, she would try to control him through government channels. Her first step was simple. She filed a complaint with the county property department. She alleged that Ethan's cabin had unpermitted structures and illegal modifications. The cabin's shed, the satellite dish, even the gravel driveway were listed as violations. The complaint was filled with half-truths and technical jargon, designed to sound legitimate enough to trigger inspection. When the county received it, they didn't know the backstory. They just saw paperwork stamped with the HOA's official letterhead and signed by its president. So they acted. A week later, a plain white envelope arrived at Ethan's cabin. It bore the seal of the County Planning Commission and a formal heading, Notice of Property Review. The letter stated that inspectors would be visiting to assess compliance with local zoning and building codes. It was polite, bureaucratic, and cold. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Karen had found a way to escalate the fight beyond her reach, into a realm where rules carried real consequences. He immediately started documenting everything again. His deed, old building permits from when the cabin was restored, even letters from the previous owner showing that the property was exempt from HOA oversight. He wasn't worried about wrongdoing. He knew his cabin was legal, but he also knew that bureaucracies could turn minor errors into expensive nightmares. Mark called when he heard the news. He wasn't surprised. "She's not done until someone makes her stop," he'd said once, and now those words rang in Ethan's head. The day of the county inspection arrived like an unwelcome echo of the last confrontation. But this time, the threat didn't come in the form of SUVs or uniforms. It came in clipboards and official seals. 2 inspectors arrived mid-morning, their county-issued truck bouncing up the gravel road. They were cautious, polite, and professional, but their demeanor made it clear they were here on someone else's agenda. They took photographs, measured distances, and wrote notes on their forms. They mentioned that the complaint came from Pine Ridge HOA and that they were obligated to follow up. Ethan stayed calm. He knew better than to take it out on them. They were just doing their jobs. But beneath the surface, frustration simmered. It wasn't just that Karen had sent them. It was that she was trying to turn the system into her weapon, bending bureaucracy around her spite. When the inspectors left, Ethan sat on his porch, staring at the trees, wondering what she'd try next. Down in Pine Ridge, Karen was already bragging. She told her inner circle that the county had taken notice of the illegal mountain property. She framed it as a public service, claiming she was protecting community values. Her followers nodded, believing every word. But the truth was that her actions had started to attract the wrong kind of attention. Not everyone in Pine Ridge admired her crusade. Some homeowners had begun to whisper that Karen was going too far, that she was turning the HOA into a personal vendetta machine. Others worried that her antics could bring scrutiny to them. Still, Karen pressed on. She began sending letters to neighboring property owners, warning them that non-compliant structures might reduce regional property values. It was a fear campaign disguised as concern. She wanted everyone on the mountain to see Ethan as a problem, to isolate him. What she didn't expect was that Ethan wasn't as isolated as she thought. Mark and his veteran friends started making regular visits, not to intimidate, but to watch, to document, and to make sure no one trespassed again. They built a quiet rotation, each taking a day or two to check in, leaving behind extra fuel and food, treating the cabin like an outpost. Their presence became a deterrent. When the second round of county inspectors came, they found a group of disciplined men waiting politely, offering coffee while explaining the history of the land. The inspectors quickly realized that they had stepped into something much larger than an ordinary code check. They noted that Ethan's paperwork was in order, that the buildings were sound, and that there was no legal violation. The case was closed before Karen even knew it had begun. The county sent her a formal response, stating that the property in question was outside HOA jurisdiction and in full compliance. To Karen, that letter was more than a rejection. It was an insult. The day she received it, she sat in her office, seething. The HOA board meeting that week was tense. Karen arrived late, eyes sharp and voice clipped. Her fellow board members, once eager to please her, now seemed hesitant. Her credibility had begun to crack. But Karen didn't retreat. She doubled down again, as she always did. She called a community safety forum and invited local law enforcement under the pretense of addressing rising security concerns. Her plan was transparent: to paint Ethan's property as dangerous and his visitors as a threat. She described his cousins as armed bikers and suggested the county monitor the situation. It was a gamble. She was trying to create a narrative that would justify another intervention. But what she didn't realize was that her obsession had started to leave a paper trail. A long, detailed record of harassment, false claims, and misuse of HOA authority. Mark's paralegal friend had already gathered everything into a tidy, labeled folder. Each letter, each complaint, each photograph taken without consent. It was all there. They were building something stronger than a wall of defense. They were building a case. By the time summer began to fade into early autumn, the mountain air had turned crisp again. The leaves started to shift to gold, and the cabin seemed to stand taller somehow, like it had weathered the storm and was ready for whatever came next. But below the ridge, in her neatly trimmed neighborhood, Karen was unraveling. Her security forum had backfired. Law enforcement had politely reminded her that she had no authority outside Pine Ridge limits. A few homeowners had even voted to suspend the HOA's expansion project, citing concerns about leadership overreach. Still, she wasn't done. The next move she planned would be her boldest yet. If the county and the HOA couldn't touch Ethan through ordinary means, she would find a way to force his hand. She would manufacture a crisis big enough to bring him down, or so she thought. Ethan, meanwhile, didn't know what form her next attack would take. He only knew that she was quiet again, and that Karen's quiet was always the loudest warning of all. And when she made her next move, it wouldn't just threaten him. It would shake the entire mountain. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. There were no engines this time, no white SUVs creeping up the gravel road, no letters or stamped envelopes. It was subtler, smaller, like a chill in the air that didn't belong. Ethan noticed it one morning when he went to check the generator. The smell of fuel was sharp, but the machine wouldn't start. When he opened the cap, the scent hit stronger, unfamiliar and chemical. Someone had poured sugar into the tank. At first, he tried to convince himself it was an accident. Maybe condensation had ruined the fuel. Maybe something mechanical had just failed. But that illusion didn't last long. The next day, his satellite dish was ripped from its mount, wires hanging like torn veins. Later that week, tire tracks appeared near the base of his driveway, wide and deep, not from any vehicle he owned. It was clear. Karen had found a new way to fight. After the failure of her legal schemes, after the county and even her own board began to lose faith in her, she had resorted to something desperate. She could no longer reach Ethan through official channels, so she turned to unofficial ones. Whether she sent people herself or inspired someone else to act, Ethan didn't know. But the signs were there. Someone was coming up the mountain at night, someone who thought they could frighten him into leaving. Ethan's cousins had gone back to their routines, but they hadn't gone far. Mark had made it clear that he and the others were only a call away. So when Ethan found his generator sabotaged and his fence posts cut, he didn't panic. He documented everything, photos, timestamps, and footprints, and sent them to Mark. Within 2 days, the Harleys returned. They didn't come in thunder this time, not as a show of power but quietly at night, their engines muffled by the forest. They parked under the trees, blending into the darkness. It wasn't a party, it was a watch. The veterans took turns sleeping in shifts, their experience making them calm and methodical. They didn't need to threaten. Their presence alone was a wall. The mountain felt alive again, though not in the peaceful way it once did. It pulsed with tension, like it was waiting to see what Karen would do next. And Karen, down in Pine Ridge, was unraveling fast. Her neighbors had started to turn on her. They whispered at board meetings, questioning her leadership. The local paper had caught wind of her property crusade and written a small but scathing article about overreaching HOA presidents in rural communities. She had become a punchline, a caricature of suburban control trying to claim a mountain. But Karen wasn't the kind to admit defeat. Her obsession had turned personal long ago. She began driving up the ridge herself late at night, headlights off, parked far enough away to not be noticed. She wanted to see for herself if Ethan was still there, if the cabin still stood, if the bikers were gone. Her anger had become a fixation, the kind that blurred judgment and fed on its own momentum. One evening when the fog hung low over the pines, Ethan noticed something glinting near the edge of his property. A drone. Small, store-bought, buzzing quietly like a mechanical mosquito. It hovered near the tree line, moved toward the cabin, and then darted back into the woods. He knew instantly who was behind it. Karen had escalated again. The veterans laughed when he told them, though the humor was thin. They set up cameras along the tree line, infrared, motion-sensitive, military-grade. And that was when they caught her. At 2:14 a.m., the footage showed a figure standing at the edge of the woods. A flashlight beam cut across the trees. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, placing something near the base of the driveway before retreating to a waiting car. The license plate was clear in the footage. It was Karen's. The next morning, Ethan followed the trail and found it. Small metal spikes scattered across the gravel road, meant to shred tires. It wasn't subtle sabotage anymore. It was intent. Ethan didn't call Karen. He didn't confront her. He called the sheriff. When the deputies arrived, they listened carefully, reviewed the evidence, and took his statement. They knew of Karen Delaney. Her reputation had reached the county office months ago. The footage and the tracks told the story plainly enough. They promised to handle it quietly, but firmly. For the first time in months, the fight was no longer just Ethan's. Down in Pine Ridge, the knock on Karen's door came just after noon. The deputies didn't arrest her, not yet, but they made their point. They questioned her about trespassing, about the drone, about the damage. Karen denied everything, of course, her voice brittle and defensive. But the message had landed. Her power wasn't limitless. Her authority ended at her property line, no matter how much she believed otherwise. Still, Karen's pride couldn't let her stop. The next few weeks became a blur of petty defiance. She filed complaints about the sheriff's bias. She called local reporters to tell her version of events, painting Ethan as an aggressive recluse harboring armed men in the woods. She flooded social media with posts about mountain lawlessness, though the comments section quickly turned against her. Ethan, meanwhile, stayed quiet. He didn't feed the fire. The veterans continued their silent watch, though gradually, as autumn deepened, they began to scale back. They trusted that Karen's momentum was spent, that she had burned too many bridges to keep pushing. But trouble rarely ends in a clean line. It fades, then flares again when you least expect it. One late afternoon, as the sun slipped low behind the trees, Ethan noticed smoke rising from the far edge of his property. Not from a chimney, but from the woods. He ran toward it, heart pounding, and found a small fire smoldering in a pile of brush near his storage shed. Someone had tried to start it deliberately, using lighter fluid and kindling soaked in fuel. The fire hadn't spread. It was caught early, but the intent was unmistakable. That night, the mountains seemed darker than usual. The shadows between the trees felt longer, heavier. Ethan sat on the porch with a flashlight beside him, every creak of the woods setting his nerves on edge. The veterans returned once more, this time without the laughter. They understood the shift. This wasn't a feud anymore. It was a threat. And down in Pine Ridge, Karen was losing her grip entirely. The HOA board had finally called for an emergency vote of confidence. Half the neighborhood wanted her removed. She stormed out of the meeting, humiliated and furious, claiming she was being betrayed by cowards. When she got home that night, she poured herself a glass of wine and stared out at the dark ridge, where she knew Ethan's cabin stood somewhere among the trees. Her obsession had consumed her life, her position, her reputation. But she couldn't stop now. She told herself that she was right, that he was the problem, not her. She made one final decision. If no one else would help her, she would handle it herself. The next morning, Ethan woke to find footprints again, smaller this time, deliberate, leading up toward the edge of his porch. Whoever had left them hadn't come in peace. And though he couldn't know it yet, that morning would mark the last calm before everything came to a head. Because Karen Delaney, the self-appointed ruler of Pine Ridge, was about to take her obsession one step too far. And when she did, there would be no going back. By the time the last leaves of autumn had fallen, the mountain had grown colder. The days were shorter, the air sharper, and the cabin stood like a lone sentinel against the creeping frost. Ethan had grown used to the rhythm of quiet days and long nights. But lately, that calm had been laced with tension, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. The tracks that had appeared near his porch days earlier were still burned into his memory. They had been fresh, deliberate, leading up to the steps and back down again. Whoever left them hadn't broken in, hadn't vandalized anything that time. It was as if they were testing boundaries, seeing how close they could get before being noticed. And deep down, Ethan knew exactly who it was. Karen Delaney had been stripped of her title as HOA president 2 weeks earlier. The board she'd once commanded with fear and polished condescension had finally voted her out after months of bad press, complaints, and legal threats. Her resignation letter wasn't voluntary, it was demanded. Her so-called security officers had quit. The county had dismissed her complaints, and most of Pine Ridge had grown tired of her war against the man on the mountain. But people like Karen didn't just fade away. They broke apart quietly, dangerously. The veterans had returned to their lives again, though they still checked in periodically. Ethan insisted he was fine. He wanted to believe it was over. Yet some part of him knew that Karen's silence was not surrender. It was the gathering of something final. Then came the storm. It was the kind of storm the mountain hadn't seen in years. Sheets of rain poured for hours, turning the dirt road into a river of mud and runoff. The trees groaned under the wind, and the roof of the cabin trembled with each gust. The air was thick with the smell of pine, wet earth, and the faint metallic tang of lightning. Sometime after midnight, between one thunderclap and the next, Ethan heard it. The sound of tires grinding on wet gravel. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Headlights flashed briefly through the rain, slicing across the trees before vanishing again. He turned off the cabin lights and watched from the window, heart pounding in his chest. A single vehicle, small and silver, sat idling at the bottom of the hill. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out. Umbrella in one hand, flashlight in the other. Even through the storm, Ethan recognized the shape instantly. The stiff posture, the sharp movements, the defiance in the stance. Karen. She was alone. For a moment, he almost couldn't believe it. After all the chaos, all the failed attempts, all the humiliation, she had come herself. Up the mountain, in the middle of a storm, to whatever end she thought would redeem her. She started walking up the drive, her flashlight beam slicing through the rain. The mud clung to her shoes, soaking the hem of her coat. But she didn't stop. She moved with the determination of someone whose pride had long outpaced their sense. Ethan stayed by the window, motionless. His instinct told him to confront her, to demand answers, but something deeper urged patience. He needed to see what she was going to do. When she reached the halfway point, she stopped, scanning the property. The beam of her flashlight lingered on the motorcycles parked under the tarp near the shed, the ones Mark and the others had left for storage. Her expression twisted in the half-light, though Ethan couldn't read it from the window. Then she turned toward the cabin, the flashlight finding its mark. She began to climb the final stretch. Lightning flashed across the ridge, turning everything white for a heartbeat. In that brief illumination, Ethan saw the gleam of something in her other hand. A small red canister. Gasoline. The realization hit him like ice. She wasn't here to talk. She wasn't here to make a scene or argue about property lines. She was here to destroy what she couldn't control. The storm raged louder, wind howling through the trees, rain coming down in blinding sheets. Karen reached the front steps, struggling to keep her footing. She crouched low, fumbling with the cap of the canister. But before she could act, a new sound cut through the storm. The low, unmistakable growl of engines. 1, then 2, then 5. The roar built like thunder on top of thunder, rising up from the valley road below. Headlights cut through the rain again, this time stronger, steadier. The veterans were back. Mark had been keeping watch from the town below, just in case. When Ethan had texted him days earlier about the tracks, Mark hadn't ignored it. He'd taken it as a warning. The Harleys tore up the road, tires spitting mud, engines echoing off the cliffs. Karen froze at the sound, flashlight jerking in her hand. Her head whipped toward the noise, eyes wide with confusion and fear. She stumbled backward, slipping in the mud, the gas can tipping over and spilling its contents onto the wet gravel. Within moments, the motorcycles arrived, circling into the clearing in front of the cabin. Their headlights cast harsh beams across the scene. Karen standing soaked and trembling, the red canister at her feet, and Ethan stepping out onto the porch at last. No one spoke. There was no need. The rain hissed as it hit the spilled gasoline, carrying its sharp scent through the air. Karen's face was pale, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her expensive coat ruined by mud and rain. The defiance that had carried her this far finally cracked, leaving behind only disbelief. The veterans didn't move toward her. They simply waited, silent and unyielding. The storm, the engines, and the flicker of headlights did all the talking. For the first time, Karen realized the truth. She wasn't in control anymore. Not of Ethan, not of the HOA, not even of herself. She turned, slipping and stumbling back down the drive, the rain swallowing her retreat. The silver car's taillights blinked once, then vanished into the night. When the sound faded, the mountain fell silent again. The veterans stayed for a while, making sure she didn't return. They helped Ethan check the property, making sure no harm had been done. The gas had spilled harmlessly onto the mud, diluted by the downpour. The cabin, scarred but standing, had endured another test. By dawn, the storm had passed. The world was quiet again, washed clean by the rain. Mist clung to the trees, and the rising sun painted the horizon in soft gold. Karen Delaney was gone, truly gone this time. The sheriff came later that day after Ethan filed one last report. The evidence was undeniable: trespassing, attempted arson, reckless endangerment. Karen was charged formally. Pine Ridge distanced itself completely, stripping her name from every document and replacing her as president within a week. Her story became something whispered about in the county. A cautionary tale of control turned to obsession. Ethan didn't celebrate. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt tired, relieved, and deeply grateful for the family who'd stood by him when the system failed to. The veterans eventually left again, their goodbyes quiet and unspoken, but their bond unbroken. Winter came soon after. Snow blanketed the ridge, softening every scar left behind. The cabin glowed warm from within, smoke curling gently from its chimney. The forest, once the stage of so much chaos, returned to its natural rhythm. Calm, wild, untamed. Sometimes, on cold nights, Ethan still thought about the whole ordeal. The letters, the SUVs, the security teams, the fines, the sabotage, and finally, that storm. It felt almost unreal, like a story told in another lifetime. But one thing stayed clear: peace was not something given. It was something earned, guarded, and sometimes fought for. And on that mountain, surrounded by the endless whisper of pine and wind, Ethan had finally earned his peace.